Jorge Masvidal has never been afraid to speak his mind, but his latest words about Nate Diaz have sent shockwaves through the fight world. For years, Diaz was celebrated as Stockton's soldier, the raw, fearless brawler who stood toe-to-toe with anyone. But Masvidal now claims there's a dark truth behind the legend, something Nate kept hidden even from his most loyal fans. In this video, we'll trace Diaz's rise, his wars, and the silence that followed, before diving into the shocking revelation Masvidal has just made, one that could forever change how we remember Nate Diaz. To understand Nate Diaz, you have to understand Stockton, a city that never gave anything for free, where crime rates soared and opportunities were scarce. Nate was born into it on April 16, 1985, the younger brother in a tight-knit Mexican-American family that lived paycheck to paycheck. His father worked construction jobs, his mother stretched every dollar, and while most kids dreamed of escaping Stockton, Nate and his brother Nick learned to survive within it. Stockton didn't raise dreamers, it raised fighters. From an early age, Nate was inseparable from Nick. When Nick started running triathlons, Nate was right behind him. When Nick found jiu-jitsu at Cesar Gracie's gym, Nate tagged along. Too young to be taken seriously, but too stubborn to be left out. He absorbed everything: the discipline of martial arts, the camaraderie of the team, and the unspoken lesson that toughness was the only real currency. If you couldn't endure, you couldn't belong. By his teenage years, Nate wasn't just another kid from Stockton. He was a young man already hardened by hours on the mats, by long-distance runs through neighborhoods where cops and gangs were equally threatening. He didn't have a plan B. Fighting wasn't a career goal. It was survival, a way to carve out identity in a city determined to swallow you whole. His teachers didn't see promise. His peers didn't see potential. But Nate knew one thing: when fists flew, he never backed down. In 2007, that stubbornness carried him into The Ultimate Fighter Season 5. Still in his early 20s, he was known only as Nick Diaz's little brother. Most fighters in the house overlooked him. Some mocked him. But when the cage door closed, Nate revealed what Stockton had built inside him: relentless cardio, slick submissions, and an ability to take punishment and keep moving forward. He won the season, submitting Manny Gamburian in the finale, and with that, secured his UFC contract. For Nate, it wasn't just about the victory. It was about proving he could stand on his own. He wasn't just Nick's shadow. He was his own storm, a fighter who could bleed, scrap, and force opponents into deep waters they weren't ready for. But even in victory, observers noticed something else about Nate. He fought with a recklessness, a willingness to absorb damage most wouldn't. It made him thrilling. It made him dangerous. And it planted the seeds for a tragic truth that Masvidal, years later, would say no one ever wanted to admit. Nate Diaz didn't become famous overnight. He became a cult hero fight by fight, bleeding his way into the hearts of fans who saw themselves in him. He wasn't polished. He didn't give company-friendly sound bites. He cursed in interviews, flipped off opponents, and walked into the cage like he didn't care if he won or lost, as long as he fought his way. And people loved him for it. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, he carved out a reputation as the UFC's most unpredictable scrapper. He fought anyone, anytime. Jim Miller, Donald Cerrone, Gray Maynard. No matter how tough the opponent, Nate brought the same Stockton energy: long, volume-heavy boxing, suffocating jiu-jitsu, and a gas tank that outlasted everyone. Even when he lost, he became more popular. Fans weren't cheering for perfection. They were cheering for authenticity. And Nate Diaz was nothing if not authentic. But authenticity came with consequences. His wars left his face swollen, his scar tissue building. He took beatings that would have broken lesser fighters and then smiled through bloody teeth as if nothing had happened. He didn't fight to minimize damage. He fought to prove he could outlast it. Fans began to see him as indestructible, almost mythical, the Stockton soldier who couldn't be killed in the cage. This myth reached its peak in 2016, when he stepped in on 11 days' notice to face Conor McGregor at UFC 196. The stage was massive. McGregor was the UFC's golden boy, destined to keep climbing. Nate was supposed to be a sacrificial lamb, but in typical Diaz fashion, he absorbed McGregor's best shots, bled freely, and then, in round 2, wobbled the Irish superstar with a left hand. He jumped on his back, sunk in a rear naked choke, and made the sport's biggest name tap out. The moment wasn't just an upset, it was cultural. Nate grabbed the mic and sneered, "I'm not surprised, mother effers." It was raw. It was real. It was Stockton. Overnight, Nate Diaz wasn't just a fighter. He was an icon. Kids imitated his slap. Fans wore his face on t-shirts. Immigrant communities and working-class neighborhoods saw him as one of their own. He wasn't corporate. He wasn't polished. He was them, winning against the machine. But what Jorge Masvidal would later reveal about Nate was that behind this cult hero image, the very traits fans love, his ability to take punishment, his defiance, his recklessness, were hiding a darkness. Nate wasn't just surviving wars. He was masking something far more destructive. The Conor-McGregor rivalry turned Nate Diaz from cult hero into international star. Their first fight at UFC 196 was the upset of the decade. The rematch at UFC 202 only fueled the fire. This time, McGregor came prepared, chopping Nate's legs, pacing himself, and outpointing him in a 5-round war. Nate lost a decision, but the story didn't matter. He had gone toe-to-toe with the sport's biggest star twice, and both fights were instant classics. For the first time in his career, Nate was headlining pay-per-views, making millions, and standing shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names in combat sports. Yet, as the spotlight grew, so did the scrutiny. Nate wasn't flashy with money. He wasn't buying mansions or yachts. He stayed in Stockton, stayed with his people, stayed stubborn. That authenticity kept him beloved, but it also left him out of sync with the machine that wanted to polish him up and turn him into a brand. Between 2016 and 2019, Nate largely disappeared from the UFC. He sat out over contract disputes, demanding the respect and pay he believed he deserved. Fans begged for his return, and when it came, it was spectacular. UFC 241, August 2019. After 3 years away, he fought Anthony Pettis and dominated, reminding everyone of his unique style and grit. Then, on the mic, he called out Jorge Masvidal. "I want to defend this belt against Jorge. He's a gangster, but he ain't from my world." That call-out set up UFC 244 at Madison Square Garden. Diaz versus Masvidal for the symbolic BMF belt. The build-up was electric. Two street-born fighters, two anti-heroes, colliding for bragging rights. The fight ended with controversy, stopped by a doctor due to Diaz's cuts, crowning Masvidal the winner. But behind the rivalry was a respect, one that Masvidal has carried for years. And yet, in 2025, Masvidal has finally spoken, hinting that what he saw leading up to that fight, and in the years after, was far darker than fans ever realized. According to him, Diaz wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting something hidden, something destructive, something he managed to keep out of public view. Masvidal's words would land like a thunderbolt, because if true, they don't just explain Nate's decline, they reframe his entire career. The BMF title fight at Madison Square Garden in November 2019 was more than just a UFC event. It was theater, spectacle, and legacy wrapped into one. Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal was billed as two street soldiers colliding, two men who carried the aura of authenticity in a sport increasingly dominated by Polish and promotion. Fans didn't need a belt or rankings to justify this showdown. They just wanted to see who would outlast the other in a war of attrition. In the build-up, both men played their parts perfectly. Diaz with his unshakable calm, Stockton slap references, and quiet digs at Masvidal's fake gangster persona. Masvidal, fresh off the 5-second knockout of Ben Askren, walked, with the confidence of a man who knew the spotlight was finally his. Madison Square Garden, drenched in history, became the stage for a fight that transcended titles. When the cage door closed, it delivered chaos. Masvidal landed heavy shots early, slicing Diaz open with brutal elbows and kicks to the body. Nate, true to form, refused to quit. Blood streamed down his face, swelling around his eyes, yet he walked forward, taunting, throwing combinations, daring Masvidal to give him more. By the end of the third round, the crowd was in a frenzy. They weren't watching for clean technique. They were watching two men fight as if the cage were just an extension of the streets they came from. Then, the doctor stepped in. The cuts over Nate's eye were deemed too severe, and the fight was stopped. Masvidal was awarded the BMF belt, but even in victory, he admitted later, something about the night didn't feel right. That dude wasn't himself, Masvidal would say years later in interviews. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he moved. He wasn't the same Nate everyone feared. He was fighting something else that night, something bigger than me. At the time, fans dismissed it as fight banter. But as Masvidal revisited the memory in 2025, his words carried new weight. Because now, he wasn't just talking about fight tactics. He was hinting at a darkness lurking beneath Diaz's exterior. Something Masvidal claims he kept quiet about for years out of respect. But now, he says, the truth needs to come out. Nate Diaz's relationship with the UFC was never smooth. He was always the fighter who refused to bend, who demanded respect and more pay, while others played the company game. After years of wars, his contract ended with the Tony Ferguson fight at UFC 279 in 2022. Nate walked away victorious, head held high, free from the promotion he had battled for most of his career. For fans, it was poetic. For Nate, it was supposed to be liberation. But liberation is a dangerous word in combat sports. Without the structure of the UFC, without constant camps, scheduled fights, and obligations, many fighters lose their anchor. Nate's fans expected him to launch his own brand, his own fight league, or at the very least, cash in on high-profile boxing spectacles. And he tried. The Jake Paul boxing match in 2023 sold well, but Nate looked slower, his volume dulled, his body heavier. It wasn't the Stockton Soldier fans remembered. Instead of victory, the fight left questions. The Masvidal boxing rematch in 2024 brought a flicker of the old Nate. He threw over 700 punches, brawled with the same grit that defined him, and edged out a majority decision win. But again, there was something off. He looked drained, not just physically, but emotionally. In post-fight interviews, he didn't gloat. He didn't call for the next big fight. He just seemed tired. Then came the lawsuit against Fanmio, the promotion behind the Masvidal rematch. Nate claimed he was owed $10 million, having only received a small portion. Legal filings painted a picture of chaos behind the scenes, broken promises, delayed checks, confusion. And while the money mattered, the bigger concern was what it revealed. Nate was isolated, surrounded by questionable advisors, lacking the security and loyalty that once defined his career. The fans noticed the silence too. Gone were the raw press conferences, the endless trash talk, the Stockton swagger. Nate's social media turned sporadic, cryptic, and sometimes concerning. Pictures of him looking bloated, clips of him stumbling through nightlife, whispers from old teammates who admitted they hadn't heard from him in months. Stockton's soldier, once loud and defiant, was now fading into the shadows. It was in this void that Jorge Masvidal resurfaced with his revelation. According to him, Nate's disappearance wasn't just a man choosing privacy. It was the result of something much darker, something Diaz had fought to keep hidden. In 2025, Jorge Masvidal sat down for an interview that would ignite shockwaves through the fight world. After years of silence, he claimed that during their BMF rivalry, and especially leading into the boxing rematch, he discovered something Diaz had hidden from the public. Masvidal's words were heavy, deliberate. Nate wasn't just battling fighters, he was battling pills. He was hooked on painkillers, man. And it wasn't just for injuries, it was to get through the day. The statement stunned fans. According to Masvidal, he had seen the signs up close. Nate, always carrying the scars of his wars, wasn't healing naturally anymore. He was relying on opioids and heavy medication just to train, just to make it through camps. Masvidal described moments in Fight Week where Nate looked dazed, sweating, distracted. He claimed Diaz's team brushed it off, calling it just Stockton toughness. But Masvidal wasn't convinced. That wasn't toughness, he said. That was a man covering up pain with pills. I kept my mouth shut then, out of respect, but people need to know. The implications were massive. Nate Diaz, the fighter fans idolized as the raw, unfiltered warrior, may have been silently addicted, masking not just injuries, but perhaps a larger struggle. Masvidal suggested the lawsuit battles, the silence, the erratic public appearances were all symptoms of this hidden fight. And while some dismissed Masvidal's comments as opportunism, others pointed to the visible evidence. Nate's bloated appearances, his sudden disappearances, his slowing pace in the cage. Social media exploded. Some fans were furious, accusing Masvidal of smearing a rival for clout. Others believed him, pointing out that Diaz's body had absorbed too much punishment to function without chemical relief. Analysts weighed in, debating whether the revelation tarnished Nate's legacy or humanized him further. Because, if true, it meant that for years, Nate Diaz had been fighting not just opponents, but himself, his body, his pain, his addiction. For Masvidal, the decision to reveal it wasn't about disrespect. He framed it as honesty. People call him Stockton Soldier, and he is. But even soldiers break, man. Even soldiers have scars you don't see. That's the real story. And with that, the myth of Nate Diaz cracked in ways fans never expected. Masvidal's words didn't just make headlines. They ripped through the MMA world like a bomb. Overnight, the conversation around Nate Diaz shifted. For years, fans had seen him as the indestructible Stockton Soldier, the man who could take any beating and keep moving forward. Now, Masvidal had planted a chilling idea in their minds. Maybe Nate wasn't indestructible at all. Maybe he was masking fragility with painkillers, hiding an addiction that explained everything from his sudden disappearances to his sluggish performances in recent years. Fans split into camps. Some defended Nate fiercely. Masvidal's lying for clout, they wrote online. He lost his shine. Now he's dragging Nate down with him. Others weren't so quick to dismiss it. They replayed Nate's interviews, noticing the slurred speech, the dazed expressions. They pointed to the lawsuit with Fanmio, his cryptic social media posts, his weight gain. Masvidal's not making this up. One fan argued, it all makes sense now. The MMA media jumped on the story instantly. Analysts dissected Masvidal's comments, comparing them to Nate's career timeline. Was his 3-year absence from the UFC after the McGregor fights linked to struggles outside the cage? Did his declining performances in the Jake Paul and Masvidal boxing matches stem from more than just age? Every piece of evidence was examined under a new light, and suddenly, Nate's story looked different. Less like rebellion, more like tragedy. Other fighters began weighing in too. Some backed Masvidal, saying they had seen the same signs. One former training partner claimed Nate often popped painkillers during long camps, brushing it off as part of the grind. Others condemned Masvidal, saying it was low to reveal something so personal about a rival. That's between him and his people, said one UFC veteran. If Nate's battling something, it's not Jorge's place to air it out. And then there was Nate Diaz, Nate's older brother, his lifelong protector. His other half in the fight game stayed silent. That silence spoke volumes. For fans, it only fueled speculation. If Masvidal's claims were completely false, surely Nick would have jumped to his brother's defense. Instead, nothing. No tweet, no interview, no denial, just silence. The fallout was brutal, not just for Nate's image, but for his legacy. A fighter once defined by resilience was now being redefined by vulnerability, and fans were left with one haunting question. If Masvidal was right, then how long had Nate Diaz been fighting not just opponents, but a hidden war with himself? The revelation didn't just spark debate among fans, it forced the entire fight world to confront an uncomfortable truth about combat sports. Fighters live in pain. Years of training, sparring, and cage wars take a toll, and painkillers often become part of the culture. But hearing Jorge Masvidal say it out loud about Nate Diaz, a man revered for his authenticity, brought that truth into the spotlight in a way no one could ignore. Dana White was asked about the comments during a press conference. His response was measured. "Look, I don't know what Jorge's talking about. I haven't spoken to Nate in a while. But these guys put their bodies through hell. They all have injuries. They all deal with pain. I hope Nate's doing good." It was hardly a denial. If anything, it sounded like an acknowledgement that Masvidal's claim wasn't out of the realm of possibility. Conor McGregor, never one to stay quiet, used it as fuel for mockery. On Twitter, he posted a cryptic jab: "Proper recovery greater than pain pills. Stockton taught you wrong." Fans quickly flooded the replies, some laughing, others condemning McGregor for kicking Nate while he was down. Other fighters responded with empathy. Dustin Poirier tweeted, "If Jorge's right, I hope Nate finds peace. These careers break us all in different ways." Michael Bisping, who has spoken openly about his own health struggles post-retirement, dedicated a podcast episode to the topic, saying, "Painkillers are the dark side of this game. If Nate was hooked, it doesn't make him weak, it makes him human." The MMA community itself split down the middle. Some accused Masvidal of betrayal, saying rivalries should never cross into exposing personal demons. Others applauded him for speaking the truth, claiming fans deserve to know what their heroes are really going through. Meanwhile, younger fighters began opening up about their own experiences. One anonymous UFC prospect admitted to MMA journalists that he'd been prescribed opioids after a surgery and struggled to stop. Another veteran admitted that half the locker room used painkillers to get through training camps. Masvidal's reveal had cracked open a larger conversation about fighter health, one that the UFC had long avoided. But through all the noise, one voice remained absent: Nate Diaz himself. No statement, no denial, no angry rebuttal, just silence. And in that silence, fans began to wonder if Masvidal's story wasn't just a rumor, but the truth Nate didn't want to face in public. As the dust settled, the question became clear. What does this mean for Nate Diaz's legacy? For years, he was celebrated as the ultimate outsider, the Stockton street soldier who flipped off the machine and fought on his own terms. His authenticity, his grit, his toughness, they defined him. But Masvidal's revelation threatened to rewrite that story. Because if it was true, then Nate's legendary durability might not have been just Stockton toughness. It might have been chemical. Every time he marched forward through punches, every time he absorbed damage most fighters couldn't. Maybe he wasn't unbreakable after all. Maybe he was just numbing the pain, both physical and emotional, with pills.